What do dough and booze have in common? Probably not what you were expecting. Maybe it's that they both rise. That's pretty different from the way a loaf of bread rises, but at least you're on the right track. Both are made by a type of microorganism called yeast, which is why we often use yeast as a biologist to study how life works. But yeast isn't just our favorite microbe for science experiments. It's also a powerful tool for medicine and biotechnology. So let's see how scientists turn a tiny fungus into life-saving drugs. This is a single cell of yeast. Like all fungi, it has a nucleus surrounded by a membrane. And it's got all the other typical cell parts like ribosomes and a cell wall. And like other living things, it needs to eat to live. But instead of having a mouth to shovel stuff inside, nutrients enter through its permeable cell wall and dissolve in water. Then the yeast cell uses diffusion and osmosis to move those nutrients around. Yeast can make its own food using photosynthesis, but only if it has enough sugar. Otherwise, it lives off the sugars in the environment, a trait called heterotrophy. Yeasts are also what we call facultative anaerobes, meaning they can survive with or without oxygen. When there's no oxygen, they make energy through fermentation. This is where the dough and booze come in. During fermentation, yeast cells break down sugar into two smaller molecules, carbon dioxide and ethanol, aka alcohol. We harness this process to make bread rise because the gas bubbles produced by fermentation get trapped in the bread dough, making it all puffy and delicious. Likewise, we can collect the alcohol produced by yeast fermentation and, well, make bread and booze. But while it's handy that we can turn sugar into yummy things, it's actually pretty toxic for the yeast. So they only do it when there's no oxygen around. And it's this unique ability that makes yeast so great for genetic research. See, most organisms need oxygen to make energy, which means you need to grow them in these big tanks with a constant supply of air. This is expensive and time-consuming, and it limits the types of experiments you can do. But since yeast can survive without air, all you need to do is stick a sample in a petri dish with some sugar water and let it grow. They reproduce quickly, have a small genome, and are easy to manipulate genetically. Plus, their tolerance to high levels of certain salts and sugars means they can survive in environments that would kill most other cells. And finally, they have a lot of plasmids. These are circular pieces of DNA separate from the yeast's chromosomes. Plasmids replicate independently and can carry genes from one cell to another. This means that yeast cells can share tools, like when we insert a gene for an antibiotic resistance into a plasmid, and then put the plasmid into a yeast cell. Now the yeast can reproduce and spread the gene to other yeast, creating a whole population of antibiotic-resistant cells. And that makes yeast a great little factory for churning out genetically identical cells, which is useful for making lots of proteins for medical research, or for testing the effects of different drugs. And speaking of medicine, yeast has helped us fight off nasty microbes since at least the 1860s, when Louis Pasteur discovered that the alcohol produced by yeast fermentation could kill harmful bacteria in wine. Since then, we've harnessed yeast to mass-produce important medicines like insulin for diabetics and human growth hormone for people who can't produce enough on their own. But surprisingly, yeast hasn't just been helpful because of the medicines we've made with it. In 2014, researchers found that a protein on the surface of yeast cells was remarkably similar to a protein on human cells. What's really crazy is that these proteins only seem to have come together via a series of happy accidents, where bits of DNA jumped between species over millions of years. Scientists aren't sure why the yeast protein is so similar to the human one, but it may be because they both do the same job. The human version helps cells take up nutrients, so maybe the yeast one does too. Or it could be that the yeast protein is actually a totally different version of the same ancient gene. This is the kind of discovery that would have happened if we had tried to engineer yeast to help humans. But because yeast is so easy to work with, scientists are now using it to create new cells with novel functions. Researchers have turned yeast into little chemical factories that produce everything from vanilla flavoring to the cancer drug paclitaxel. And yeast cells can even detect certain chemicals, like when scientists modified them to look like little light bulbs. When exposed to a toxin, the yeast cells light up, which could help scientists quickly identify dangerous substances. So whether it's making bread rise, helping us find new medicines, or producing all sorts of useful chemicals, this tiny fungus continues to make our lives better in big ways. Thanks for watching this episode of Biologic Master. Please subscribe and see you soon.